back to Don't Know Much About with me, Dr. Naya Lekht. I'm a teacher, a writer, and a speaker. My motto is, it all starts with a question. Don't Know Much About is a show devoted to some of the most talked about issues that are often misunderstood. I'm here to clarify and make the complex accessible. In the last episode, we unpacked the Nakba, its origins, and how it is used today to delegitimize and demonize Israel. On this week's Don't Know Much About, we are going to take a look at one of the most misunderstood and complex forms of hatred, anti-Semitism. Now, when I was younger, I was never satisfied with the following answer to what is anti-Semitism and why the Jews. I was told that anti-Semitism is a form of othering, or that anti-Semitism is bigotry. Elsewhere, I was told that anti-Semitism is a tool to scapegoat the Jews. Now, I'm not saying that there aren't some truths to each of these descriptions, but it never really fulfilled my urge to understand why the Jews. More importantly, why should we study this phenomenon? Anti-Semitism, we are told, is the longest, most durable hatred. I would also add that anti-Semitism isn't really about the Jews, though, of course, the Jews do pay a heavy price for it. A lot to unpack here. So let's begin by thinking of anti-Semitism not just as a form of bigotry, but as something more significant, as something indicative of larger issues. In her opening statement at the Munk debate on June 19, 2024, attorney Natasha Hasdrov observed that anti-Zionism is, quote, the most important topic of our age, end quote. Now, from the outside, it must seem strange to say, for how could hatred directed at 0.2% of the world's population be the most important topic of our times? However, if you know a thing or two about anti-Semitism, it is one of the first critical symptoms of a diseased society. It is the alarm system that goes off to signal decay within a society. In sum, it is the most urgent topic of our time because the Jew forces the world to wrestle with morality. Now, when I teach about this topic, I begin by asking, when did Jew hatred start? And it's not such a simple question, because the answers really vary depending on how one conceptualizes and imagines the Jews. What is anti-Semitism then? Well, I think it's the perennial casting of the Jew in the role of villain, but no simple villain. The Jew is an avatar, an archetype for what a given society deems to be morally evil. This is why, for the anti-Semite, fighting the Jew becomes a virtuous act. To rid the world of the Jew is a moral requirement. Maybe this is what the French philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre wrote when he wrote, "If the Jew did not exist, the anti-Semite would have to invent him." Now, we can say that the Jew is cast in this role as a deflection from the real crimes committed by society. I'm, of course, reminded of Soviet-era Jewish journalist Vasily Grossman's pithy observation when he wrote, "Tell me what you accuse the Jews of, and I will tell you what you are guilty of." Let us then map out the archetype of this Jew through three distinct eras. First, anti-Judaism, second, anti-Semitism, and third, anti-Zionism. In each era, the Jew is seen as violating the guiding principles of the society. In simple terms, in the era of anti-Judaism, Jews were seen as violating the tenets of Christianity, culminating, of course, with the accusation of deicide, of killing God, Christ. In the era of anti-Semitism, the Jew was viewed as violating the purity of race, or what was then thought to be the most advanced field of inquiry, race science. And in the era of anti-Zionism, in our time, the Jew, vis-a-vis Israel, is seen as violating human rights. Why human rights? Well, what do we care most deeply about today? What are our guiding principles? It seems human rights. This is why, if you look at the form that anti-Semitism takes today, it is dressed in social justice language. Accusations of apartheid, racism, genocide, notice each a violation of human rights. What is key here is to zoom out and look at the three eras and see that in each, the Jew violates that which the society or civilization deems to be moral. Now, I'm always impressed by my students, and once, when teaching on this very topic, a student raised her hand and observed, "Dr. Lekht, if we could predict what society will think is morally pure in, say, 100 years, we could forecast what Jew hatred will look like." Very smart student. So now that we understand how Jew hatred functions, that is, by casting the Jew as the villain, we must ask another critical question. How do we know when something is anti-Semitic? Surely one can criticize a people without doing so in a bigoted manner. In the year 2016, a group of scholars and legal luminaries came together and crafted a working definition of anti-Semitism known as IHRA, or the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition. Now, this working definition, it's really crucial to understand, it's non-binding, and on the whole, has not been very successful in terms of helping people know and see what constitutes anti-Semitic speech and or behavior. I have to be honest with you guys, back in 2016 and even 2018, I was a big champion of IHRA. But having spent time in the classroom teaching about the history of anti-Semitism, I realized it may not be the best tool. Moreover, for scholars of anti-Semitism, enshrining and codifying a complex phenomenon such as anti-Semitism limits our ability to keep up with a hatred capable of evolving and shifting. So, how do we know when something's anti-Semitic? Taking inspiration from the great Rabbi Jonathan Sacks, who compared Jew hatred to a virus, I began to think, okay, so if anti-Semitism is a virus, what would its DNA be? If I could discover and isolate the sequence, I could provide, so to speak, an inoculation that would help people identify it. Here, then, is the unique DNA sequence of anti-Semitism in the form of leading tropes used to malign the Jewish people collectively. We can call it tropes, we can call it accusations. In some, they are 1. Blood libel, 2. World domination, 3. Demonization, 4. Dual loyalty, 5. Dehumanization, and 6. Avarice or greed. Now, what is critical here is not how you call this hatred, but rather the accusation or the trope and its application. Let's take the first one, blood libel. So blood libel originates from around the 12th century in England with the death of a Christian boy named William of Norwich. A few years later, a monk traveling through the town of Norwich hears about this boy's gruesome death, and he decides to write a book, a hagiography, making William a saint. And in it, the monk writes that William was tricked by local Jews and slaughtered for religious ritual purposes. This accusation that Jews are bloodthirsty and kill non-Jewish children spread like wildfire. And even after the Jews were expelled from England in the 13th century, this accusation continued to spread all across Europe. Some vivid cases are the 14th century Simon of Trent blood libel case, the Damascus affair in 1860, the Baylis trial in Russia in 1913, and the Doctors' plot in the Soviet Union in 1951. Now, you would think that in the 21st century, this ancient story would have been entirely debunked. But the truth of the matter is that it is one of the leading tropes used today to malign Israel and Zionists. Just take a look at propaganda cartoons coming from the Arab world where Israeli leaders, from Ehud Barak to Bibi Netanyahu, are shown eating or drinking the blood of Palestinian Arab children. And I know what you may say. Now, wait a second. In the conflict between Israel and Gaza, innocent people and children are dying. Isn't this just a reflection of a very grim reality? Yes, true, innocent people are dying. But notice, it is only the Jews who are depicted in this way. In the war against Ukraine, started by Russia, do we have cartoons showing Putin eating children? No. Or how about Bashar al-Assad, who is responsible for over 500,000 deaths in Syria? Is he depicted eating children? No. This, then, is the marker of anti-Semitism, a trope unique to the Jews. Let's quickly go through the 5 other tropes, starting with world domination. Now, this one's very simple. Jews control the banks, the media, the world. Often, it's seen in political cartoons, we find a Jewish octopus or a Jewish spider controlling the globe. At its core, it's a conspiracy theory that accuses Jews of secretly wielding so much power that they can control the world and all the world events. The Jews can subvert democracies, start wars and revolutions. For this reason, anti-Semitism is not very similar to racism, which views people as being subhuman. You see, with this accusation, the Jew has these supernatural powers. The Jew has the power and abuses it for his nefarious gains. Number 3, demonization, is another feature of the DNA of anti-Semitism. Although anchored in Christian texts and notions that Jews are to be found in what Martin Luther called amongst the den of the devils, in consorting with the devil, the Jew defames, he lies, he blasphemes. Now, today, in the 21st century, if you ask a person, do you believe in devils? I'm pretty sure many people would say no. But do people still believe in evil? Of course. And what is the most evil thing today? Well, racism, Nazism, apartheid, colonialism. And this is why accusing Israel or Zionists of being racists, Nazis, and colonizers is demonization. 4, dual loyalty. Now, that's the 4th trope in the DNA of this virus. Now, because the Jewish people are a people, a nation, we're actually called an Am Yisrael, and have lived dispersed outside of their ancestral homeland for over 2,000 years, wherever Jews lived, that is, in the host countries, the host countries were suspicious of these people. Where do their loyalties lie? Now, for example, when the Jews were emancipated during the French emancipation in the 1850s, Count de Tonnerre famously decried, "To the Jews as a nation, give nothing. To the Jews as individuals, give everything." De Tonnerre was not wrong in seeing the Jews as a collective. This would happen again in 1948 when Golda Meir, then the ambassador from Israel, she visited Moscow, and she came to the Moscow synagogue, and thousands of Jews came to greet her. For Joseph Stalin, who had feared any form of ethnic or religious nationalism, Jewish presence at that synagogue signaled that he had a case of disloyalty on his hands and called the Jews, quote, a fifth column. The irony in all of this, of course, is that the Jews, wherever they went, since their expulsion from Judea, wanted so much to prove their allegiance to the host countries that assimilation became a mode of survival. On the whole, Jews happen to be one of the most loyal subjects, whether to an empire or a state. Take, for example, the protests in the United States even today. Look at the rallies in support of Israel, and you'll find a plethora of American flags. Now take a look at Palestinian protests with no American flags. The 5th accusation is dehumanization, and this one, of course, shares the most with racism. This is also the form that anti-Semitism took during the Nazi era. Today, however, I don't think this is not a prominent feature of anti-Zionism, as Israel is not depicted as being subhuman. Now, the 6th and final accusation is avarice or greed. Now, this accusation links Jews with money. We can trace this connection to a few events. First, in the New Testament, we are told that Judas sold Christ to the Romans. He betrayed him, basically, for 30 pieces of silver. From here, we can see the development of this accusation in the form of Jews being untrustworthy. Next, Jews were forced into the position of moneylenders in England, and in many ways they financed the Crusades. This, then, is how I teach my students to be able to identify anti-Semitism. Look at the tropes. Look at the accusation and their application to Jews, to Israel, or Zionists. Blood libel, world domination, demonization, dual loyalty, dehumanization, and greed. And here is where it gets really important. It doesn't even matter what you call it, anti-Judaism, anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism, because what is critical is the trope, not the hatred it is called. What is essential in all of this is to understand that when you accuse a people of being bloodthirsty, of controlling the world, of being disloyal, there are consequences. For if a people are out for blood, they're evil. And if they're behind world unrest, and if they steal, they're illegitimate. And if they're disloyal, they're also untrustworthy. And what do you do with an evil, illegitimate, untrustworthy people? There is no other solution but to exterminate the Jews. This is why the answer to the Jewish question, which at its core asks, what do we do with these people who are so different, came in the form of the final solution, the attempted extermination of Jews during the Holocaust. Antisemitism evolves. As anti-Semitism evolves, we have shifted from the Jewish question to the Israel question. What do we do with a country that is illegitimate and evil? There is no other answer than annihilation. It is perhaps for this reason that the German Jewish philosopher Hannah Arendt wrote that the anti-Semite seeks to exterminate. His goal, not to colonize the Jew, to enslave or expel the Jew. The goal is extermination. Consider this. Hitler came to power in 1933. Now, the extermination of the Jews did not occur in 1933, nor did it occur in 1938. The extermination of the Jews occurred in 1941. It took Germany and Europe 8 years to be ready to annihilate the Jewish people. And how was it done? Through a very determined propaganda campaign that suggested that the ailments of the world were to be found in the Jew. So to rid the Jew from the world was thus to rectify the world. Now, as we approach the closing of today's show, I pose another critical question. Why must we study anti-Semitism? What is there to gain from it? In 1993, Arthur Miller wrote a play, and it was called Broken Glass. In it, a Jewish character states really emphatically, "Don't you understand that when the last Jew dies, the light of the world goes out?" The Jew forces the world to wrestle with morality. When we fight anti-Semitism, we are necessitating the world to do something about this moral breakdown. Where there is anti-Semitism, there is a larger problem. Thus, anti-Semitism functions, as I said earlier, as an alarm system. Look, in ancient Greece, the Hellenists hated the Jews because they embodied something spiritual, and the Greeks very much celebrating the body, the beauty of the corporal world. In the 19th century, with the rise of race science and Darwin's theory of survival of the fittest, the Jews symbolized equality, that all humans are made in the image of God and are therefore holy. This is why the Nazis tried to exterminate us. We interfered with their moral compass. Tell me what the worst thing to be, and I'll tell you it's the Jew. So what's the worst thing to be today? Easy. Look at the collective Jewish defense. We are not white colonizers, ergo, the worst thing to be is a white colonizer. I've often wondered, what if the Jews were white? Would that automatically disqualify them from inclusion or from having their own country? Now, of course, Jews are not colonizers, far from it. In fact, if we look at the Levant and who ruled over it, Jews were actually the only people to have had a sovereign kingdom, but never an empire. Jewish kings were never interested in expanding their kingdoms, but that's not the point here. The point here is to investigate the crime of colonialism, for it anti-Semitism awakens us to be able to rescue Western civilization. We must consider how we have imagined colonialism. And how have we imagined it? As a crime committed by the white man. In simple terms, were it not for the white European man, people living in what we call third world countries would live peacefully. This reading of history is, of course, sophomoric. Long before the white man colonized the lands, the Arabs colonized North Africa, the Levant, and much of Europe by expanding the caliphates. Indeed, if you really care about ending racism and ending slavery, your eyes would be on the African continent, where today, close to 5.2 million human beings are enslaved by radical Muslim groups. But how does this relate to the present? More specifically, what is it that we represent that the anti-Semite today finds so detestable? I think we stand for truth. In a 2023 study on Generation Z, and if you're Generation Z, listen up, researchers asked participants to rank values from most important to least important. So what they find? Generation Z's top 3 values were family, empathy, and community. And guess what was at the very bottom? It was truth. This is why our youth have been captured by a framework that does not care about truth. Rather, they care about power and power dynamics, the oppressor versus the oppressed. Anti-Semitism therefore first forces us to re-examine our values. Suppose the Jewish people stand against this framework that privileges power. In that case, fighting anti-Semitism becomes much more important. It becomes about combating misguided views and ideologies that make the world a worse place. We used our time today to unpack a complex form of hatred, to show that despite its capability of evolving, certain core features remain the same. This brings me to a question from Zoe A. from Colorado. Zoe writes, I'm still struggling with how to understand Jews who are anti-Zionist. Are you saying that Jews can be anti-Semitic? Also, many Jews do not identify with Zionism. Does that make them less Jewish? Thank you for this really important question. It's not an easy question to answer, and I know it sounds strange to label Jews as being anti-Semitic, but I think we must set the record straight on Jews and their complicity in anti-Semitism throughout history. Now, here are a few examples for you, Zoe. During the early Soviet period, there was a group known as the Yevsektsiya, or the Jewish section of the Communist Party. Though short-lived, this group, made up of Jews, harassed fellow religious Jews on the streets, sometimes even beating them. They did this because their goal was to revolutionize, modernize the Jews who lived in shtetls and clung to these old traditional ways. Much earlier, way before the Soviet Union, in our history, there were the Hellenistic Jews. Now, these Jews agitated against the religious Jewish doctrine and sometimes performed reverse circumcision to participate in the Olympics. Also, in the Soviet Union, there was a Jewish anti-Zionist committee. These Jews participated in cultivating the narrative that Israel was a Nazi state. Can Jews be anti-Semitic? Well, from history, we definitely see that Jews can most definitely play a role in fomenting hatred toward their own people. Their intentions don't really matter to us, as the outcome was and is a surge in Jew hatred. Now, regarding Jews and how they identify. So I've been, studying this, and according to some Pew data research, I found that about 20% of Jews in America observe the Sabbath or Shabbat. But Zoe, you would agree with me that Shabbat is core to Jewish observance and Jewish identity. This is why I don't like to use the phrase pro-Israel, as it sounds just about as ridiculous as pro-Shabbat. Thank you for joining me on Don't Know Much About. To recap, 1. Anti-Semitism is one of the most complex forms of hatred because it has the capability of evolving and mutating to look different in different social and political contexts. 2. What remains consistent, however, is the core DNA of this virus, the 6 accusations: blood libel, world domination, demonization, dual loyalty, dehumanization, and avarice. And 3, I know this is kind of a tricky one. Anti-Semitism is not really about the Jews. It is an early warning that a society, an institution, or a movement has been infected. This is why anti-Semitism in our colleges and K-12 schools must be taken so seriously. It's about saving these institutions from moral decline. Remember, it all begins with a question. Let us continue to ask questions and pursue truth. Stay tuned for future episodes. If you want me to cover a topic in a future episode, drop a comment below or find me on social media. I'm Dr. Naya Lekht, and this is Don't Know Much About.